who is the initiator of Mindful Money, which is a social enterprise, I'm told. But Barry really needs no introduction because he was a MP for the Green Party for a little while, 18 months, I think. And before that, he was director of Oxfam here in New Zealand. We have Vijay Naidu, who is a development studies specialist and professor of development studies up until the end of last year. He's now professor of governance and development, I think. And then we have Yvonne Underhill-Sem, who needs no introduction to anybody who's here from Auckland University. She's with development studies at Auckland. Here's Barry, good. Okay, so we're going to start, and you know, we've had some fabulous panels today and yesterday, so this hopefully will further build on what we've already been speaking about. I'm going to start with Joe. I don't have my glasses. After 20 years of after 20 years of advancing the promise of trade-led growth through free trade. Sorry? I beg your pardon. Yeah. And, you know, the idea of trade-led development through free trade, and 14 years of the MDGs to tackle poverty and inequality in developing countries. We still have the problem of widespread poverty, and we also have a problem of growing inequality amongst nations and within developing countries as well. And this has been taking place even in the context of rising incomes, as is claimed in parts of the South. And now, of course, we have the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are supposed to address the ongoing problem of development with all of the new development challenges that have emerged since the MDGs. So, Joe, I know you have a lot to say about the MDGs and what needs to happen to trade, or trade agreements and negotiations to ensure that the SDGs are attainable. And do you want to start by sharing some of your thoughts on that, and bearing in mind that the difference with the SDGs from the MDGs is that there are responsibilities for developed countries as well?
So thanks, Claire. As you say, the SDGs are actually about all of us. No longer is it about developing and developed, it's about all of us on this planet together. And so in this broadest conception, the Sustainable Development Goals are 17 goals that encompass life on Earth, essentially. They're about building a world where all people's dignity is upheld, where we leave no one behind, and where we have a healthy planet to sustain us. So really, I think we've been talking about the Sustainable Development Goals for the last 2 days. And although we haven't really talked much about the trade impacts and repercussions for lower income countries, I'm actually going to take a broader view, and I really want to take a sort of a global perspective and talk about power. Because a trade system that puts people and planet first is a trade system that works for people here in New Zealand or people in the Pacific or anywhere across the world. And it is a global trade system. And trade is really key to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals because it's what we do as humans. You know, if you think of trade as the exchange between us, we've always done that and we always will. And trade is also very linked up with the food we eat, the buildings we live in, how we get about, all those sorts of things. So trade can be quite a powerful tool to achieve the broad Sustainable Development Goals. But as we know, our current trading system is broken and it doesn't work for us all, and it has left people behind. And at the core of this is the issue of power. Who has it and who doesn't have it? And those who have it, political and economic power, are a small number of people, and they've been making the decisions and shutting the doors on the rest of us. So the question for me really is, how do we alter these power dynamics? How do we transform them? And this, for me, gives rise to two further questions. I'm a bit like Carrie, lots of questions. But I think we've been grappling with these questions over the last 2 days. One of them is, do we fight for a seat or influence at the decision-making table as it stands, or do we go away and create our own table? The other question is, do we focus on the local and where we stand and having a solid place to stand, or do we go global like Russell Norman was arguing and we create a global community of earthlings? And I think to begin to transform power dynamics, it's not an either or, it's both. We need to be doing all of this together simultaneously. We need people influencing the decision makers, so people like Jane, policy advocacy people like myself, trying to push the current agenda as far as we can. We need people on the streets, a citizen activism, trying to hold governments to account. And we need people who are taking those creative, transformative approaches and really trying to think about a real alternatives, some of which we heard about yesterday, like the Southern Initiative and Annie's group. I wasn't in Auckland here. So they're building these microcosms of inspiration, really, so that we can have these alternatives to hold up and showcase when the opportunity comes to really expand them. And we need local action and global action because this is a global system. The decisions that get made in Washington, DC have an impact here on the streets in Auckland or the shores of Tuvalu or the factories in Dhaka or the deserts of Chad. It's a global system, and so we need to work both locally to have a solid place to stand from and to have local examples of what works, but also globally to change that system from both levels. And then as well as doing this both and, we also need to build connections, I think, build the relationships between all these different sites of action and all these different types of action so that these relationships slowly build up a network, an alternative system. And I think this hui is a really important contribution to that, coming together, hearing from diverse perspectives who are doing different things in different ways, and sharing ideas and hopefully building connections that we can go away with and keep building on. And for me, this is how we change a system. We build this web that pushes and pulls the current system to make it as good as we possibly can while eroding it, and at the same time build up an alternative system that when we've eroded the current system far enough so that it's going to collapse, we have an alternative system there all ready to roll out. So for me, the question is not so much about what a progressive trade agreement looks like, but how we can change and engage with transforming the power dynamics that maintain the status quo. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wonder if I could... Oh, okay. Yeah, I just want to ask a follow-up question, Joe. I'm following Barry's kind of format of the panels. From your experience with Oxfam, which, you know, has always, you know, taken a critical perspective on trade, yeah, in the sense of, you know, wanting trade to be made more equitable. And bearing in mind what Sanya shared with us about, you know, countries that are, for instance, making changes certainly in the way in which trade agreements are made public, or, you know, sorry, not agreements, but positions of countries are being made public. And bearing in mind your interest in SDGs and seeing that as a big, you know, global development, if you like, program, is there a way that you can politically use the SDGs to challenge some of the ways in which, or to challenge, you know, for instance, the secrecy basis on which a lot of these trade agreements are being negotiated, but also just the nature of trade agreements, and say that, you know, you can't achieve the SDGs with these constraints that are put on countries. So can you politically use the SDGs to try to make some changes?
I think you can. To some degree, it depends upon how much political engagement there is with the SDGs, and it is a normative agreement, so it's all about that global peer pressure. But they do provide quite a solid argument that trade is a tool for these overarching goals and they're interlinked. But I also think the SDG process gives us a really good firm grounding as well, because that was like the most consultative process that the United Nations had ever gone through. Like, there was something like 4,000 consultations, there were reports and reports, there was an online mechanism for people to make comments. It was hugely inclusive, relatively, for the UN. And I think what that highlights is a recognition that these processes need to be inclusive. And what I'd like to see, that can be put forward as a model, a global model for engagement in discussing trade agreements. It's really about making sure that civil society is at the table right from the inception, and that there's those variety of perspectives at the inception. So I think we can get quite technical about including chapters on everything, but actually it's about the process and trying to make that process far more inclusive so the voices are there at the beginning. But again, if you're just going to get the door shut in your face, so it's hard. So there's a tension there.
Thanks, Joe. I'm going on to Barry. Since the WTO ministerial in 1999, which saw huge protests, public protests on the streets of Seattle, multilateral trade discussions and negotiations have seen a sharp division between developed and developing countries, or what you might call the global north and the global south. And the WTO's attempted development round was, of course, pretty much a disaster or failure, with developing countries declaring that this was no level playing field. So Barry, my question to you is, what do you see as the main challenge or challenges for developing countries in the free trade agenda, and what needs to change in the approach to negotiating multilateral and bilateral trade agreements to genuinely support development in these countries? And just taking up from what Joe said too, do you see trade as this overarching frame necessary for development?
So I'm really glad that Claire asked the question about the little bit of historical context, because I think we do history really badly on some of these issues. I mean, the sort of the lead-in to the Seattle trade talks was the campaign against the multilateral agreement on investment and all of the attempt to shove investment rights into a trade agreement. So that's kind of what Seattle was all about. And, at a stage that we're sitting here talking about the tppa and agreements like that, there's a history to this. So it started in the actually in the 1940s, but there's been a long campaign to try and get investment rights into trade agreements. So we need to understand the historical context. But the historical context for Seattle was also around what you touched on yesterday, Claire, which was the aftermath of a period of structural adjustment programs where developing countries had had a whole lot of debt pushed on them, then interest rates had risen, they got severely indebted, the IMF stepped in and said, oh yes, we'll help you, but on the basis that you open up your economy and completely liberalise your trade and undertake all sorts of government austerity measures and other forms of extreme kind of pro-liberalisation measures. And basically they pushed developing countries in order to do an extreme and very rapid form of liberalisation. So by the time developing countries got to Seattle, they're actually pretty angry. And one of the misconceptions is that Seattle collapsed because of the protests on the streets. Wasn't that at all. I was in the negotiations at that stage, and it was because the developing countries said, we will not accept your agenda. And the African countries, for the first time, stood up and said, we reject the agenda that you're trying to foist on us, and we actually have some powers. And the background was that previously, under GATT, there had been essentially a stitch-up of trade agreements, and developing countries had absolutely no rights due to extreme abusive processes, etc., etc. Finally, with the establishment of the WTO, they were meant to have some rights in trade negotiations, and in a way they started insisting on their rights. They collapsed Seattle and then collapsed Cancun 4 years later over the same issues, which was an attempt to put investment and other issues into trade negotiations. So that's kind of an important context for all of this. But we're talking about alternatives, and I just kind of, at the risk of sort of dumping stuff down, I just wanted to lay out 4 issues that I think really need to be changed from a developing country perspective on trade. The first is what didn't happen in trade negotiations under what was meant to be called the Doha Development Agenda. Remember that? The development conveniently got lost out of the Doha agenda. And that was an attempt to say that the trade rules had been skewed in favour of the rich nations, and developing countries had received, in a way, adverse terms of trade. So in fact, the poorer you were as a country, the higher the trade barriers that you faced. And to some extent that's still the case, because textiles and agriculture are the 2 most protected sectors, which are the things that typically developing countries are able to export. So they faced those problems. So there's an unfinished business around just making the basic rules of trade fairer for poorer countries, and particularly for poorer producers. So there's a whole kind of set of things around there, including reforming the decision-making systems that allow a perpetration of those unfair rules. A second area, and we've talked a little bit about the development rights or space for development. In terms of the dynamics of development, that's really important, the right to development. And what does that mean? It's allowing developing countries to prioritize poverty reduction over rights for foreign companies. It means allowing developing countries to be able to support their nascent kind of infant industries so that they can get to the stage where they can produce things and be able to compete internationally. And what's happened under trade liberalisation and structural adjustment is when developing countries have tried to start up their new industries, they've been flooded with imports from overseas and have wiped out their struggling, fledgling industries. So they've found it very hard to get a foothold. And how did developed countries ever do that? Well, they protected their own industries when they were developing. The US had the highest rate of protection in the world for a century, and so there's a blatant hypocrisy. It's a kind of do as we say, not as we did, and all of the OECD countries used protectionism during their development, as did the East Asian countries, a combination of protectionism and state intervention. And we all know the stories of how the East Asian countries developed. It wasn't let the market rip. It was very much a process of state intervention. And there's issues about capital controls being particularly important for developing countries as well. A third issue is developing countries are particularly hit by a lack of enforceable rules on multinationals. And there are kind of 3 basic areas. One is tax havens and tax avoidance, and good work that Oxfam and many others are doing on that, but it just strips capital flight, tax avoidance, tax havens, strips capital out of developing countries. There's the issue of a lack of any fair competition policies, so that there's predatory pricing to wipe out competitors in developing countries. And of course, there's issues like impacts of climate change that are causing major problems for developing countries. So, and finally, as well as having international rules on multinationals, I think that we need international rules on the accountability of governments towards their citizens. And this is kind of the notion of a social charter for governments that has been strongly resisted by governments, but governments need to be accountable to their people. And I think that we ought to be inverting the whole discussion around trade agreements to say, when are we going to start to get the agreements on multinationals? When are we going to get agreements that will ensure that states are accountable to their citizens. So that's my agenda for change.
Thanks, Barry. And just a follow-up question, and thank you for making mention of the right to development. Do you think that trade agreements could be made to comply with international human rights laws and principles? Is there some way that we can, require trade agreements to incorporate that?
I think, as others have said over the past 2 days, not without a fundamental kind of reordering of the hierarchy, that at the moment human rights laws and legislation, where there are any specific provisions, and many of them don't have that, they remain as principles, but where they do have specific provisions, they are unenforceable and they are able to be overridden by trade agreements. So if we looked at a changing the hierarchy of those things, then and the other element is of course allowing the democratic space for countries to determine their own human rights standards, which may be different, but within parameters of international norms.
Vijay, as a development scholar and a Pacific Island specialist, the Pacific Island countries have long been seen as small, isolated, resource poor, and powerless. My question to you is this how people and states in the island Pacific see themselves today? And what are the specific or distinct development challenges for Pacific Island countries or Pacific SIDS, small island developing states? What are the challenges now and into the future? And can these be addressed through the SDGs or through an alternative and progressive trade strategy?
Thank you, Claire. The response to the first question is yes and no. There is enormous diversity in the countries of the Pacific in terms of size, resource endowments, and human capacities. Some are not really isolated, small and remote. So you take a country like Papua New Guinea, it's actually bigger than New Zealand, and it's got a huge amount of natural resources, bigger both in terms of size, physical size, and population. And on the other hand, we have Jeff Bertram here. He studied these Mirab, economies. There's places like Tuvalu, Kiribati, Nauru, Marshall Islands, which are indeed small, isolated, and very dependent countries. So the potential for development in these countries are extremely variable. A major challenge, or amongst the challenges to begin with, is climate change. Generally speaking, we talk about the atoll states of Tuvalu, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, which have relatively smaller populations than those larger countries that have these huge deltas and coastal plains where the majority of the people are settled. And many of these places are below 3 meters, like the atoll states. So the impact of rising sea level would actually affect these bigger countries as well, very seriously. And of course, we also have now extreme weather conditions. We had Cyclone Winston, which was a Category 4-5 cyclone, and the intensity of some of these extreme weather events is actually increasing and becoming more extensive. Most of these island countries have been reliant on primary production and extractive industries, agricultural commodities, mining, logging, and fisheries. And unfortunately, the relationships as to who benefits from these activities have been very unequal. And we have also caught the structural disease that the reforms under the neoliberal model that was pushed very hard in the 1980s and 1990s, particularly by none other than Australia and New Zealand, in conjunction with international financial institutions, well, this disease has affected us very seriously. Inequality has increased, and the level of poverty in these islands have risen. So in terms of the Gini coefficient, Pacific Island countries actually have a worst index regarding inequality compared to Southeast Asian countries. With respect to the Sustainable Development Goal as a possible sort of framework within which we can address some of these problems, I'm a bit cynical about it. It's probably because of old age. SDG 14 is to conserve and sustainable and have sustainable use of the oceans. Like the MDGs, the 17 SDG goals are noble goals, global goals, but I'm cynical on the grounds that it's business as usual. What has really changed? And what I see is Papua New Guinea, Fiji, and the Cook Islands have now moved towards providing concessions for deep sea mining exploration. In fact, Papua New Guinea, which has the worst record for terrestrial mining in terms of environmental and social impact, has become the first country to actually start deep sea mining. Yeah? So I don't want to be altogether negative, because we human beings have certainly made huge progress. For example, with regards to drift net fishing, that's been banned and has had a very positive impact. And then we all work together to reduce the ozone hole in the atmosphere, and it's been possible. So I don't want to be a complete naysayer, but I don't want to join the chorus, who's sort of waving the flags for SDGs. The free trade has been a big problem for Pacific Island countries. As you know, a number of Pacific Island countries really have nothing to export. So, and the economies are already open. So how much more open do you want these economies to be? And in regard to that, as I think Barry has mentioned previously, the main source of revenue was, taxation tariffs at the border. And you take this away, our middle class, our upper class, and our masses just don't have the income levels to provide revenue. And yet we have adopted these one-size-fits-all types of tax reform, where the generalized tax system, the sales tax, the VAT, is now very commonplace in the islands. The system that really suited us was PATICA, this South Pacific Regional Trade Agreement, where we had preferential access to the Australasian market, and there were similar sort of arrangements with the American Trust Territories, with the mainland market. And of course, all of that got eroded and finally removed altogether, because they are not compliant with WTO rules. And this is my stronger objection to this, bull about one size fits all, and the level playing field that this free trade brings about. Because it's idiotic for anybody to say that these small Pacific Island developing states have the same capacity to trade with a global giant like China. It's an absolute nonsense. But that's the way it seems to have been argued during the neoliberal phase. And finally, I just want to say that in terms of confidence building and in terms of, the kind of dependent mentality, I think a lot has changed from the 70s, 80s, and the early 90s because of the China factor in the Pacific. Small island states now have some leverage because they can always go to China for a more sympathetic hearing compared to what, unfortunately, Australia, New Zealand, IFIs, and the Western countries have been, having in terms of relating with the Pacific Island countries. And so that's been a major factor in terms of the leverage that these countries have. And of course, Fiji has led the sort of charge with, the look north policy, not necessarily for all positive reasons, following the 2006 coup, but many other Pacific Island countries are following suit, and I think that's been very powerful. And I came wearing this red t-shirt, but to avoid catching cold, I've been avoiding, wearing it. But this is Tonga. Yeah? Tonga playing Australia, a medium-sized Pacific Island country that is now got the confidence because of the prowess and the comparative advantage that Polynesians have given their size and strength in rugby union and rugby league. Thank you.
Working? Yeah. Thank you, Vijay. What Vijay didn't add is that he's also in solidarity with Tonga because he considers that Tonga was cheated of a win in the World Cup rugby, right?
Yeah.
By the referee's decision, I should add. I do have a follow-up question for you, Vijay, but I'm going to come back to you for that. Yvonne, Pacific Island countries have looked to trade negotiations as a way of securing labour mobility commitments from their developed country trading partners, and they initially did this during the negotiations on an EPA with the EU, and then subsequently on PACER Plus. And this was to address problems of high unemployment and, low job opportunities or limited job opportunities in their own home countries. You know that neither of those partnership agreements or PACER Plus, it is a partnership agreement too, included labour mobility, but we have had New Zealand and Australia commence or initiate short-term labour employment schemes for Pacific Island countries. And there have been some problems, more in regard to Australia than New Zealand's scheme. But how significant are these schemes, in your view, in contributing to development in Pacific Island countries? How can their development impact be strengthened? For instance, are there possibilities of transfer of skills, some sort of training, so that what they learn during this short-term employment periods that they're in, Australia and New Zealand, is useful back home in their home countries?
Sorry, I wanted to come up here for two reasons. One, I wanted to get a photograph of you all, so it looks great, and I often don't get a chance to take pictures of all, so it's there. And secondly, it's been great this last few days hearing the bigger picture and having my colleagues speak a little bit more about that. So there's 5 words I want you just to keep in mind as I go and answer your question. And Vijay started off. The first word is refugees. The second word is rugby. The third word is limes. The fourth word is bananas. And the fifth word is Maseratis. What do they all have in common? Think about it. But I do want to come back to Claire's question. Last week, I was in Honiara for the Pacific Labour Mobility annual meeting, which is part of the PACER Plus in the sense that it is an agreement to have this annual meeting. And I managed to get to the first one. Now, the first one was held in Christchurch, where civil society researchers were not invited. It was run by MFAT, by New Zealand. Then I tried to get to the second one, and I went in as a bona fide researcher, though I had a few other connections at that time. And so I managed to get there in a very difficult kind of way, and they kind of allowed me to slip into the Pacific Caucus. I am from the Cook Islands and Niue and New Zealand, so it was not difficult for me to decide I could sit with the Cook Islanders or the Niueans, or in fact the Papua New Guineans, where I have heritage family as well. So I was able to slip into this space where there were discussions around this labour mobility and how it worked for Pacific countries. Now, what was notable about that was there was no organising framework for Pacific countries to say, what is our joint kind of position on this? Instead, there was a lot of discussion around what they call first mover advantage. And what that meant was that the smaller countries like Kiribati and Tuvalu were really trying to protect the possibilities of their citizens going elsewhere against countries like Vanuatu and Solomons in particular, and Fiji was picked up on. So there was an opportunity, the space was there, but it was a space that we didn't really know how to use. There was nothing that kind of gave us the sense of, so how do we use this space? And partly because everybody was bought and paid for by Australia at that time, and so they had a bilateral lined up already with Australia and with New Zealand. They had Australian employers sitting on the edges, ready to come in and say, come and work in my sector. So it was all set up in such a way that the Pacific Island countries there was no structure there. There was a record of the meeting that had been written prior to the meeting. And so when we picked that up, we kind of said, well, that doesn't say anything. I still haven't seen that record of the meeting. I have been asking at many different levels, can we have a record of that meeting? Can we, and I've asked DFAT colleagues and MFAT colleagues and Pacific colleagues. There's no record of that meeting any longer. This year, they had it up in Honiara, so that was another interesting space. One of the interesting things about that as well is that the person in Solomons who was organising it became the Minister of Colin Beck, became the Minister of Foreign Affairs in the process of the week that we were there. Now, Colin Beck is a very well-known person on the Pacific space in the UN. I think he was recently in the UN, very in climate change. And so we were talking about what kind of, what we wanted to have an outcome. He was particularly wanting to have an outcome. So an hour before the end of the last day, we had an outcome document that had been written by somebody. And we spent 1 hour with people trying to say, what does this mean? Where does it go? There were proposals to have they wanted to have a mechanism whereby these could be discussed. So there was a recognition that there was no mechanism for it to be discussed. And so Colin Beck, who's now the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Solomon Islands, is in a very good position now to follow that through. So I suspect we're going to get a little bit, and of course Solomon Islands put their hands up to do that. Now what all this says, and in the whole meeting, the 2-day meeting that we had there, our colleague who said, engage with others that you're not normally used to engaging with. So I think many of us have done that. And, sitting around the table with employers from Australia and New Zealand who employ these workers is not the nicest conversation you have when people begin to talk about what we need to deal with is we need to deal with the breeders, because that's the big problem. We have too many breeders and not enough workers. I'll leave it to your imagination to think about what that was about. But these are the good employers, because these are the employers who've come to this meeting at their own cost to say we need more Pacific workers. At the same time, the Pacific countries are sitting there and they are competing against each other in order to get into these particular markets. So it's a very difficult kind of space. I kept thinking about PICTA, and I know about PICTA. I know the difficulties with PICTA, but PICTA actually was a space where Pacific governments didn't have Australia and New Zealand in the room. But there's no, I don't know who the motivating, it's something that I'll continue to think about, what the motivating, what the momentum needs to be to get the Pacific Islanders to think about it. So we had 2 days of discussions around labour mobility. The day after that, all of us who were talking about labour mobility left the country, and all the trade people came, and on the Friday, they talked about PACER Plus. So there was no discussion between the labour mobility people who do the organisation of getting people in and out of the country and the people that are negotiating the trade agreement. So this is one of the real difficulties we have when we try to bring in the issue of, yes, there's no doubt for many workers in the Pacific that it is a really good thing to have an opportunity to come to New Zealand or to go to Australia. There are many, many success stories about that. And of course, those success stories were brought into our discussion last week, and I've spoken to many of them. And it is something that you would not want to, you would want someone to, you know, if people are being able to save $5,000 when they've gone from the highlands of Papua New Guinea to Australia, you know, I don't want to say I can't give them $5,000. So there definitely is an opportunity. What I've been trying to argue is that the triple win framework, which is what is continually kind of pulled up in amongst donors in particular, that we need to shift this to this win-loss. And it's a quadruple win-loss. Actually, it may be more than just 3 or 4 dimensions. One of the key dimensions that are missed out are all the ancillary services that bring people from one country to another. The transport operators, the people who build the accommodation, the people that feed them, the people that do the pastoral care. So we've also got to look at that group as well. So, did I answer your question? There's definitely an impact of the seasonal labour migrant mobility in the Pacific. In Tonga, 1 in 4 of every man aged between, I think, 19 and 45 has been involved in seasonal mobility. 1 in 4, 25%. Now, what does that mean in terms of crops that are being grown in Samoa, in Tonga? What does it mean in terms of the social tensions around in families and communities? What does it mean around the domestic market? It's quite significant. Similarly, in Kiribati, where they have had their seafarer movements for some years now, over 10 years, one of the things that's coming out in terms of some research there is that it's only when the children of the seafarers have reached an age where they can speak about what it was like when their father came back after 9 months. It's pretty grim reading if you really want to understand that. Also in Kiribati, you know, where they pride themselves in also training women to participate in this whole project. And there have been some very, very, very distressing stories about there was 8 young women who were trained to be on a cruise ship in the householding area. Of the 8 young women that ended up on a Norwegian cruise ship, 7 of them became pregnant, which is not necessarily a bad thing, and one of them, the other one, committed suicide. So there's something dreadful happening in some of these spaces that are clearly need more attention. But in order to really shine the light on that, we've got to deal with the way in which the Pacific governments are responding to the call from New Zealand and Australian employers to come work with me as somebody who trades the chance to have economic rights. They trade off their social and cultural rights. So absolutely clear, coming back to some of the issues, there are lots of things we can do. There's things we can do in terms of assessing prior learning. There's things we can do operationally in terms of ratcheting up wage rates every time they come here. So there's absolutely operational things, but there is the big picture stuff we've got to look at as well. So how we move in those both directions is a bit of a challenge.
Thank you.
So the refugees, I mean, we cannot forget refugees. These are also migrants in New Zealand. And I'm talking about Nauru here. You know, it is a Pacific problem that has been caused outside our region, and we need to really do something about it. Rugby we've heard about. If anybody else doesn't have a red t-shirt on or haven't seen the Tongan flags going, we've probably got all those Māori, all those Tongan workers have come from around the world there. Okay, limes. This is Niue Language Week. Limes are one of the largest exports from Niue to New Zealand. Maybe 5 or 6 boxes. So it speaks a little bit to to Vijay's point, is that you can't make economy based on limes. Bananas? Anybody read the newspaper about the Samoan bananas? The first time that we've had Samoan bananas imported into the New Zealand economy, and the New Zealand economy for bananas is valued at something like $150 million. We've had the first 500 cartons of bananas from Samoa. Now, should we be celebrating that? Yes. Why in 2018? You know, so there's a long way we can go in that. And what was the last one? Oh, Maseratis. Maseratis? Nobody's been following APEC and PNG. Nobody's been following the fact that there absolutely the hospitals are out of drugs, there's the teachers are not getting paid, and there's a large number of Maseratis that have been imported from some dealer in Sri Lanka to take people around Port Moresby on the new roads that will only be new for a little while for the APEC meeting coming up. So, there were also Bentleys in there. Very depressing, but yeah, very depressing. Sorry.
Thank you, Yvonne. Yeah, I had a small follow-up question for you, and then I'll do the one to Vijay, but just kind of really brief responses because we've got a whole lot of questions here. So the follow-up one for you really goes into the possibilities for longer-term settlement for at least some Pacific Islanders in New Zealand, knowing the importance of remittances back to families and thing, or should we, so that's, you know, the question, but there's a second question about, or should we be concerned about the possible impacts on Pacific economies of human resource loss? So it's a double-edged thing here.
So firstly, there are a number of visa access categories for Pacific Islanders into New Zealand already. They don't seem to be working particularly well. One that is I think is quite a useful one, which is a 2-year, it's a permanent one that allows them, they've got to get a job here within the first 3 months. And the idea is to encourage them to work in a rural area and to stay in. So that one is a little bit undersubscribed, and that one can certainly be strengthened. The other one about training, and there was a wonderful opportunity in Christchurch when and it was very difficult because they recruited a lot of builders post-earthquake. So they put a call out for builders in the Pacific. Now this was pretty close to when Winston happened. So the very same time that you need builders in Fiji, New Zealand is putting a call out to have builders come to New Zealand. There were some 200 applicants for that call. And of that call, I think about 20 of them came from Fiji. In order to employ them in New Zealand, they developed, I think, a useful technique of assessing prior learning. So when you don't have the qualifications that you can put on a bit of paper, there is a process where you can assess prior learning. I think there's a lot of scope for assessing prior learning. The alternative to that is to what I'd suggest is like a pipeline approach, which is the APTC approach, which is we tell you what the qualifications are and we train you to those qualifications. The difficulty with that is like most pipelines, you've got to know what your resource is and you've got to lay it down in a particular way. Not a lot of flexibility in a pipeline, and it's quite extractive. The process of assessing prior learning, I think, has got a lot more ability to assess the prior learning of folk who come from the Pacific, and as we all know, are already working when they leave.
And Vijay, the second question to you, and I just cut to the chase. The World Bank has stopped using the two categories, developing countries and developed countries. I think this is since their 2016 World Development Report. Is this just about categorization and naming, or might abandoning the term and the category of developing countries impact on development responsibilities of developed states? What do you think?
Thanks, Claire. I disagree with this change in categorization, but bankers can use the income-based terminologies, but it's not historical and it's not holistic. So I disagree because it takes away the historical context of plunder, colonial harm, and the disadvantages that these former colonized countries have. And I invite people to read Jason Hickel's works on this dimension. And although in appearance there is indeed some convergence, the point here is that the power imbalances between global south countries
and the North countries is not captured by the country income-based categorization. So China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, Nigeria, Mexico will power commiserate to the changing economic circumstances in the global stage compared to European countries and the United States of America.
We're going to go on to questions. I'm looking at the time. We've got, is it almost 15 minutes? Because we started at 25 past? Yeah, okay. Another 10. Okay. So we've got 2 questions here, which are specific about achieving the SDGs. It doesn't say specifically to Joe, but I'm just going to throw it out there. One of them is, do you think the TRIPS proposals in the FTAs help achieve SDG 3 on affordable medicines and combating diseases? And do you think the 11 CPTPP chapters, which undermine tobacco control, help achieve SDG 3, re-implementing the WHO's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control?
No.
No to both.
Tobacco should just not exist. I mean, I don't know why it is in trade agreements. I think it's appalling that it was in PASA. I can't answer the first question, sorry, because I don't know enough about TRIPS.
Okay, and the second sort of related question, because it is also about health, how can countries like Fiji meet the SDGs, such as universal health care, when the World Bank is pushing them to privatize Lautoka and Bar hospitals? Just a little update on that. In fact, what Fiji is moving towards is public-private partnerships in both those cases. I don't know that that's any better. In fact, I would suggest it's probably worse, because the investor comes in, they sign a contract under which the Fiji government will be basically, expected to ensure that they get the profit that they expect to get. Yeah, and so there will be, costs to Fiji. It's not like an outright purchase. But Vijay.
I think you've answered the question already, Claire. Yeah. That's fine. I think, the problem there is that the per capita income in Fiji is still below 8,000 US dollars a year, with a majority of our people, as much as 70%, earning below 20,000 Fijian a year, which is about 12,000 US. And so once you bring these kinds of, private-public partnerships, then, people will probably have huge problems affording access to health services. We don't do enough in the area of public health and preventive health. And so our problem with NCDs, like other Pacific countries, is actually escalating. And under these circumstances, you won't have universal public health care at all.
Thank you, Vijay. There's 2 other sets of questions. They're directed to Joe and to Vijay. So to Joe, what do you think could be the effect of the contemporary partnership? Discourse on the power dynamics between developed and developing countries. I don't know if I've got that right. What do you think could be the effect of the contemporary partnership discourse on the power dynamics between developed and developing countries? Is this like convergence?
Is there someone in the audience who asked that question? Oh, okay. Yeah, is that what you mean? You like in terms of brokering and facilitating partnerships and that whole model? And what impact that might have on the power relationships between developed and developing? Well, I think if you implement the principles, as I understand of this new partnership model, I think it could be positive. Because my understanding of it is that you start with talking about your shared values, your shared goals, the problem you're trying to address, and come to some kind of shared understanding about what everybody's perspective of that is. And so I think that's about a really positive process of sharing ideas and thoughts and starting off on a relationship where you understand each other and then move forward collectively from that point. So I think it could be really positive if it's done properly and doesn't just get captured in the rhetoric and not actually implemented in practice. And then also you have to take into account the existing power relations and whether some of those conversations are possible. Sorry, it's a cynical side of me. I'd like to hope that they're possible, but sometimes I think it's just hard, yeah. And I think a lot of the things I'm saying, they aren't easy, but I think we have to try, yeah. Does that answer your question?
There's a second question here. It says to Joe, but I imagine Barry would equally be appropriate for this, since you used to work for Oxfam as well. What could be the ways of tracking the effect of development aid through the SDGs?
There's indicators proposed for the SDGs, 17 SDGs, 169 indicators, and a few thousand targets. Yeah. It can very quickly descend into a tick box exercise, and I think the first two questions around kind of how compatible is TRIPS Plus in trade agreements with the SDGs just shows the incoherence of government policies towards the SDGs. Because on one hand, you've got trade negotiators who are trying to give rights to foreign multinationals that will make medicines more expensive. On the other hand, they're using the rhetoric of the SDGs to say, oh yes, we're going to deal with health issues. And part of my experience was during the whole Millennium Development Goals, and the Millennium Development Goals sat there on a shelf and were completely useless in the same way until there started to be a grassroots civil society campaign to hold government to account to the MDGs, and they started to gain some power, but they didn't until civil society decided they were a tool that could be used in order for government accountability. And, can the indicators of SDGs be used to hold government to account? In some countries, there are some fledgling movements that are trying to do that, but I think that they haven't, the campaign to do that hasn't had the same push that the MDGs did have. And the Millennium Campaign run by the United Nations is really important for the MDGs because it empowered grassroots civil society to get involved and actually really campaign on their governments for that kind of coherence that we need. And certainly we haven't seen that kind of campaign on the SDGs in New Zealand yet, have we?
Can I just add on aid and the SDGs? Like, I'm not sure that the question said tracking aid, whether it's about monitoring aid spending and how it's contributing to achieving the SDGs. I think that could be a really powerful tool that us in New Zealand could use to hold our government to account for SDG 17, which is about the global partnership, which includes aid. In terms of, I think, shaping an entire aid program to fund all the SDGs, my preference is for the aid program to respond to country SDG plans and what they decide is important for them and feed the aid into that. But certainly as a broad concept around the different areas of the SDGs, the economic, the social and the environmental, I think our aid program needs to have a solid balance across all those areas in general.
Thank you, Joe. It looks like we're almost time up. I'm just going to give you 2 minutes each just to say whatever you want to your last comments.
Yeah, well, structurally some things have not changed in the island countries. Migration and remittances remain very important, especially for those countries that don't have any significant export commodities. The smallest island states, some of them have now been renamed large ocean states, and there is some truth in that. And there's a big talk about blue economy, of which you know more about than I do, Claire. But structurally, the issues of huge power imbalances between North and South and between small island states and the bigger states is still there. And I suppose, as we were discussing here earlier on, it's important for some collectives to gel together to push common objectives. And in this regard, the Pacific Island small island developing states group in the UN, and they work together with the Alliance of Small Island States, IOCs, is now making some difference. SDG 14 actually is due to the assertions of small island states, and the big push regarding climate change is also something that's coming via the small island states advocacy. So there are some positives there, but the business about power asymmetries still remain.
I think I just want to return to my question of how do we change the power dynamics, and throw that back at you and invite you to come and tell me what you think, because I'm really keen to hear what other people think about how we can mobilise more and more people to be engaged in these sorts of conversations. And it's absolutely fantastic. We've had 9,000 hits on the website, but I'd love to see 1,000 people in the room. So how can we mobilise people to action so that we can get that countervailing power really working? I'd love to hear what you think.
I think one thing I'd like to see is all of us learning Māori fluently so that we can have this conversation in Māori. Secondly, we also need to learn Topizin, or one of the Pacific languages, so that we can have a conversation in another language as well.
I wanted to come back to the question about the language of partnership that was used, and just kind of again for history as a reminder, there was the Paris Agreement on aid effectiveness and subsequently the Accra Declaration, and it was a whole process around how to change the relationship between donors and so-called recipient countries into a framework of partnership. And it was to try to not only kind of correct some of the imbalances in power, but also to aid accountability to civil society and the people for each of the societies, donor and developing country. And that stuff has just, gone nowhere and been sidelined. And I feel kind of, having left Oxfam in 2014, I ended up being a little bit cynical about the role of donors in the aid program, exacerbated by my anger over the PESA Plus agreement, that actually the dynamics haven't really changed, that actually donors are still pursuing their self-interest and their political interest, primarily through aid programs, rather than really being responsive to the needs within developing countries. And developing countries themselves are not being adequately responsive to their societies and framing priorities. And I think there's a dual responsibility there, and we could kind of be saying that it's just a question of forming the perfect partnership, but actually I think there's a more fundamental issue on what principles are those partnerships based, and I think we've had some good discussions about that in the last couple of days.
Thank you, Barry. Yes, I'd like to ask you all to give a big hand to our panel. And I'm sorry, there are about 3 other questions that didn't get answered, but they'll be handed to